The silent cry. The town of Willowbrook was an ideal picture of small-town peace and quiet. Officer Ben Harper knew every nook and cranny of this town, every familiar face and quiet street. But there was something about this morning, some invisible tension in the early sunlit hours, that made him restless as he drove his patrol car through the neighborhood. It was late spring, and the park was usually quiet at this hour, its only visitors the early morning joggers or an occasional dog walker. Today, though, as he neared the playground, Ben's eyes caught on an unexpected sight. A young girl, alone on a swing, her small figure nearly swallowed by the oversized sweatshirt she wore. She looked around 10 years old, her head bowed, and her feet barely touched the ground as she rocked gently back and forth. Ben's heart twinged at the sight. Children playing alone was not an uncommon scene, but something about this girl was different. The way she stared vacantly into the distance, clutching the swing chain with white knuckles, sent a chill through him. Pulling his car to a gentle stop, Ben took a deep breath before stepping out. His instinct told him to approach slowly. He had learned the hard way that his badge, a symbol of safety to some, might invoke fear in others. So he softened his gaze, his posture relaxed, as he slowly walked toward her. The sound of his shoes crunching on the gravel made her look up, her eyes wide and alert. She was clearly uneasy, but she didn't move or flinch away. "Good morning," Ben greeted softly, with a reassuring smile. "I'm Officer Ben. What's your name?" The girl's gaze darted around, her expression wary. She hesitated before finally whispering, "Layla." "Well, Layla, it's nice to meet you." He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, wanting her to feel safe and seen. "Are you waiting here for someone?" Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't answer. Ben felt an invisible barrier between them, a wall built of fear and secrets. He noticed her tiny fingers gripping a small, crumpled piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you okay, Layla?" he asked, his voice as gentle as possible. Instead of answering, Layla glanced down, her eyes dark and uncertain. Then, in a swift motion, she reached out and tucked the crumpled note into the front pocket of his uniform. Her hands were so light, he barely felt it. Before Ben could ask her what it meant, she was already on her feet, bolting across the park, disappearing into the line of trees at the edge of the playground. "Layla, wait," he called, but she was fast. Too fast for him to follow without startling her further. Ben's mind raced. The encounter had lasted barely a minute, yet the desperation in her eyes felt like an entire story compressed into a single moment. A young girl, alone and scared, handing a note to a stranger and fleeing without a word. He took a deep breath and reached for the crumpled paper in his pocket, trying to ignore the strange sense of foreboding it carried. Carefully, he unfolded it. 2 words stared back at him in shaky handwriting. "Help me." A chill ran through his spine as he sat in his car, the note trembling in his hand. He read the words again, unable to shake the urgency that radiated from them. Why had she chosen him, a stranger, to share her fear? He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that this wasn't something he could ignore. Back at the station, the note remained crumpled in his hand as he tried to piece together what little he knew about the girl. He reached out to the local schools, but no one seemed to know a Layla fitting her description. Calls to nearby neighborhoods turned up no results either. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben found himself staring at the note again, feeling haunted by the silent cry for help. There was something so familiar in the fear he'd seen in her eyes. It reminded him of his own daughter, Lily, during her last days, withdrawn, afraid, and in need of a help he hadn't realized she'd needed until it was too late. The memory hit him like a wave. His hand trembled as he clutched the note tighter. This time, he told himself, he wouldn't ignore the signs. He wouldn't let another young life slip through his fingers, not if he could help it. The next morning, Ben was back on duty, more determined than ever. He returned to the park, hoping Layla would reappear. He walked the entire park, checking under the play structures, behind the bushes, and around the picnic tables. But the park was empty, as if she'd vanished into thin air. Frustrated, he sat on the swing where he had first found her, feeling a heavy weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders. As he looked around, his eye caught something glinting in the grass under the swing. He knelt down and picked it up, a small charm bracelet with a single delicate heart charm. The bracelet felt oddly heavy in his hand, as if it held answers he couldn't yet see. Driven by both duty and an unexpected sense of personal responsibility, Ben placed the bracelet in a small evidence bag and returned to the station. He spent hours sifting through reports, trying to find anything that could lead him to the girl. Missing person reports, neighborhood calls, emergency dispatch logs, anything that might provide a clue to Layla's identity or her need for help. Yet each lead left him empty-handed, intensifying the feeling that he was running out of time. That evening, as Ben sat alone in his small, dimly lit office, his mind replayed the moment he'd looked into Layla's eyes. He felt an ache that was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of his own grief and a motivation to help her in ways he hadn't helped his own daughter. Finally, as the clock ticked past midnight, he closed his eyes and whispered to the empty room, "Where are you, Layla?" The days that followed felt like a blur. Ben found himself walking through the same quiet neighborhoods, his eyes scanning for any sign of Layla, for anyone who might have seen her. He felt compelled to retrace every step they'd taken, every word she hadn't spoken. But each time he found himself back at the beginning, with the same two words echoing in his mind: "Help me." Traces in the dark. Ben Harper's heart and mind remained tangled in the words on that note. "Help me." He felt a strange urgency. This wasn't a situation he could simply log and leave. Something was gnawing at him, insisting that Layla was out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone to answer her silent plea. The next morning, he found himself back at the park, almost as if drawn there. Early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like ghostly arms across the empty playground. He walked in silence, every step echoing with an emptiness that only magnified his worry. Ben scanned the area, retracing his movements, hoping for even the smallest clue that might lead him to Layla. At the far end of the park, just beneath an old oak tree, Ben noticed something half buried in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away the dry earth, revealing a small, well-worn notebook, its cover adorned with faint doodles and marks from a child's pen. Ben's heart raced as he gently opened it, careful not to disturb the fragile pages. Inside, the pages were filled with drawings, little stick figures, hearts, and tiny stars scattered across the yellowed paper. But as he flipped through, his hand stilled when he saw a drawing that stopped him cold. It was a crude sketch of a small house, scribbled quickly, but there was something about it that was haunting. To the left of the house was a figure of a child, marked with an arrow pointing toward the word "me," and on the other side, an adult figure with "Mom" scrawled above it. Behind the two figures was a looming shadow, a dark form with jagged lines, positioned just outside the house, its ominous presence seeming to watch them both. A chill ran through Ben. Who or what was this figure supposed to be? It was clear that this wasn't just a child's innocent doodle. There was a story in these lines, one filled with fear. He slipped the notebook into his jacket, feeling the weight of it press against his chest as if it were alive, beating hard. Ben spent the next few hours visiting nearby homes, showing the neighbors a picture he printed from his dash camera of Layla from their brief encounter. Most shook their heads, not recognizing her, but one elderly woman hesitated before speaking. Yes, I might have seen her," she murmured thoughtfully, her gray eyes narrowing. "She's the little one that sometimes walks over to the small grocery on 5th Street. Poor thing, always looks so lonely. I thought she might have been one of the Willis kids." The Willis family. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't immediately place it. "Do you know where they live?" he asked, feeling a small spark of hope. "Oh, they used to live on Elm Street. The woman replied, "But that was some time ago. I think they moved after the husband left." It was a sad business. Ben's heart dropped slightly, the hope dimming. But there was still a chance Layla or her family might have stayed somewhere in town. Elm Street was known for its older homes, often rented by families passing through. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. As Ben drove toward Elm Street, a memory resurfaced, an old case file from 2 years back involving the Willis family. Their names had been buried under a mountain of routine calls, but he remembered now. A domestic disturbance, an argument that had gotten out of control. The case had been marked as resolved, with no follow-up. When he reached Elm Street, he found the house. An aging, pale green 2-story with a sagging front porch and windows that seemed to stare blankly back at him. Grass grew high around the edges of the yard, and the place had a general air of neglect. It looked abandoned, but Ben's intuition urged him to investigate. He knocked on the front door, but only silence greeted him. Peering through the windows, he could make out faint outlines of furniture, covered in dust. It looked as though no one had lived here in months. Turning away, he walked around the side of the house, searching for any signs of recent activity. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a small, faded ribbon caught on a bush near the back door. It was frayed, the bright pink turned pale by weather and time. He gently removed it from the bush, his mind flashing to Layla's small, frightened face. Was it hers? Back in his patrol car, Ben's mind reeled with possibilities. Could Layla and her mother have stayed here, even temporarily? And what about that shadowy figure she'd drawn? Was it a person? A memory? He felt more haunted than ever by her plea. As dusk settled in, casting long, heavy shadows over the town, Ben sat at his desk in the police station, staring at the open notebook in front of him. He flipped through the pages once more, tracing the outline of the shadow in the drawing. His gut told him this wasn't just a child's fear. It was something real, something she'd seen or felt. And if it was a person, then that meant Layla could be in danger. With renewed urgency, Ben decided to dig deeper. He pulled up the old file on the Willis family, scanning through the details of their history. Layla's mother, Sherry Willis, had filed a restraining order against her husband, Marcus, just a few years back. The records were clear. Marcus had a history of instability, with multiple arrests for assault and battery. According to the case notes, Sherry had feared for her and her daughter's safety. Ben's chest tightened as he pieced together the clues. Could Marcus have found them? Was Layla running from him? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The next morning, Ben went to the local elementary school where he'd seen kids about Layla's age playing. He hoped that someone might recognize the description he'd given, or perhaps Layla herself would appear. As he waited, a young teacher approached him, a look of concern etched across her face. "Officer Harper here looking for a girl named Layla, right?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "Yes," Ben replied, trying to keep his voice calm despite the urgency brewing inside him. The teacher glanced over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "I think I might know who she is. A little girl named Layla Willis joined our school last semester, but she left just as suddenly as she arrived. She was quiet, withdrawn. I didn't have her as a student, but I remember she kept to herself." Ben's heart sank. He had been so close, yet Layla was gone again. "Do you know where she might be now?" he asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. The teacher shook her head. "No, but I remember hearing that her mother wasn't well. Some of the other teachers were worried about her. Layla seemed so sad, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her little shoulders." As he walked away, Ben's mind spun with the teacher's words. Layla's mother wasn't well. That might explain the loneliness, the isolation. But if her mother was too unwell to care for her, who was taking care of Layla? Back at his desk, Ben reviewed the restraining order details again, feeling the creeping sense of dread. The restraining order had expired just last year, and since Sherry and Layla had vanished, It was possible that Marcus had reappeared in their lives. He picked up his phone and called social services, hoping they might have more information on Sherry and Layla's situation. After a long wait, a sympathetic social worker named Anita came on the line. "Officer Harper, I can confirm that we did receive some welfare checks on Sherry Willis and her daughter. Sherry had health issues and was struggling financially. Layla, well, the little girl was doing her best to keep it together, but it was clear she needed help." Anita sighed, her voice heavy with regret. Unfortunately, they slipped through the cracks. Ben clenched his jaw, feeling a rising anger on Layla's behalf. A child, alone and afraid, with no one to help her. The system was supposed to protect her, but it had failed. And now she was out there, scared and alone, desperate enough to slip a note into the pocket of a stranger. He hung up, his mind made up. He would find Layla, no matter how long it took or how many doors he had to knock on. This wasn't just another case. This was a promise to a little girl who had put her last shred of trust in him. As he stared down at the drawing in her notebook, Ben realized that the "help me" scrawled in the shaky handwriting wasn't just a cry for help. It was a declaration. She was reaching out to someone, anyone, who would listen. And now that he wouldn't let her down. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ben rose from his desk, determined to follow every lead, chase every shadow, until he found her. Threads of a tattered life. The morning fog clung to Willowbrook's quiet streets as Officer Ben Harper began his day with a cup of black coffee and the weight of a child's mysterious note. He couldn't shake the look in Layla's eyes, a depth of fear no child should carry. As he sat at his desk, the note, the little pink ribbon, and the weathered notebook lay before him like puzzle pieces with no clear connection. The name Willis flashed in his mind, reigniting his determination. He would trace her family's past and try to find anyone who could shed light on Layla's situation. His first stop was the courthouse to retrieve additional records on Sherry and Marcus Willis, hoping they might point to Layla's whereabouts. He was greeted by Teresa, a clerk he'd known for years, who gave him a sympathetic nod as she handed him a manila folder filled with reports, protective orders, and police complaints. "Be careful with this case, Ben," she whispered. "It's not one of those simple domestic disputes. There's a lot hidden in these pages." Ben nodded, his fingers itching to open the file right then and there. But he took the folder back to his car and flipped through the documents, each word painting a grim picture. Sherry's complaints against Marcus were alarming. Violent outbursts, threats, and property damage. One report described an incident where Marcus had broken into their house after Sherry refused to let him see Layla. Sherry had documented several encounters, pleading with authorities to intervene, yet none of the cases led to serious repercussions. In one faded document, he found a handwritten note from Sherry herself. "If something happens to me, please look after Layla. She's all I have, and I'm terrified that he'll come for her. She deserves better than this." Ben swallowed hard, feeling a pang of anger and sorrow. It was clear that Sherry had been crying for help for years, her voice lost in the noise of bureaucratic delays and unfulfilled promises. He realized now that Layla's note, "Help me," was not just her plea but a continuation of her mother's. He closed the folder, his heart heavy. He was not just looking for Layla. He was searching for the remnants of a family torn apart by fear. A thought crossed his mind. What if Marcus had found them? What if he'd returned, forcing them into hiding? Determined to exhaust every avenue, Ben returned to the police station and requested a list of all emergency calls made from the old Willis residence in the past year. As he sifted through the records, he noticed a series of calls placed by neighbors reporting strange noises, and once, a man seen lurking near the house late at night. These reports ended abruptly 3 months ago, just around the time Sherry and Layla had disappeared. His next stop was the old grocery store on 5th Street, where he hoped someone might remember seeing Layla or Sherry. The small store was a staple of the community, and its owner, Mr. Patel, knew most customers by name. As Ben entered, the familiar jingle of the doorbell was followed by the warm smell of fresh bread and spices. Officer Harper. Mr. Puttle greeted, his face brightening. Haven't seen you in a while. How can I help? Ben flashed a friendly smile. Good to see you too, Mr. Puttle. I was wondering if you might know a family named Willis, Sherry and her daughter, Layla. I think they may have come in here from time to time. The old man's expression softened, and he gave a slow nod. Ah, yes, I remember Sherry and that little girl, Layla. Poor things. They would come in once a week, always bought the same things. Bread, milk, a little fruit. Sherry would usually look over her shoulder, as if someone was following her. Did you notice anything unusual in the last few times you saw them? Ben asked, his voice low, hoping not to frighten any customers nearby. Mr. Patel scratched his chin, his brow furrowed. Come to think of it, yes. The last time they came in, Sherry had a bruise on her cheek. She tried to cover it with makeup, but you know, sometimes you can't hide these things. Ben's stomach tightened. Did she say anything to you about what was going on? Mr. Patel shook his head sadly. No, but she looked frightened, more so than usual. She paid for her groceries in cash, and when I tried to give Layla a candy bar, Sherry pulled her close and told her not to talk to anyone. Ben processed this, feeling a sense of urgency deepen. Layla and her mother had been on edge, likely preparing to flee. But why hadn't Sherry asked anyone for help? Did she believe no one would listen? Thank you, Mr. Patel, Ben said, clasping the man's hand gratefully. If you see or hear anything about them, will you let me know? Mr. Patel nodded earnestly. Of course, officer. I hope they're all right. That little girl looked like she carried the world on her shoulders. Ben left the store, his mind swirling with images of Layla's frightened face, her eyes carrying the weight of secrets no child should bear. He climbed into his patrol car, glancing at the notebook still tucked into the glove compartment. Help me. Those words had become more haunting with each passing day. Ben spent the afternoon following every possible lead, searching neighborhoods, talking to local residents, and visiting nearby shelters in case Sherry and Layla had taken refuge in one of them. But it was as if they had vanished, their lives dissolved into thin air. As dusk fell, Ben returned to the station, exhausted but unwilling to give up. He began researching Marcus Willis, pulling up past addresses, acquaintances, and known associates. Marcus had been in and out of prison, mostly for minor offenses, but there was one disturbing detail. He had recently been released after serving time for assault. A sinking feeling overtook Ben as he thought about the timing. If Marcus had been released recently, he might have gone looking for Sherry and Layla, possibly even forcing them to go into hiding. Ben knew that if Layla was hiding from her father, she wouldn't easily come forward, not even to him. Just as he was about to close his laptop, his phone rang. It was Mike, a colleague on the force, calling with some news. Ben, I checked out the property records like you asked. The Willis family had moved into a temporary rental after they left Elm Street. It's a small place, run down and tucked away on the outskirts of town. Here's the address. Ben felt a surge of hope. This was the lead he'd been waiting for. Grabbing his car keys, he thanked Mike and made his way to the address. The house was even more rundown than he'd imagined, a small shingled structure with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged dangerously on one side. The overgrown weeds and cracked windows gave it an abandoned look, but as Ben approached, he noticed faint footprints leading up to the front door. His heart raced as he stepped forward, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon, ready for anything. He knocked, his fist echoing against the hollow wood. Sherry, Layla, it's Officer Ben Harper. I'm here to help. Silence. The stillness was thick, but something in the air told him someone was inside. He knocked again, a little louder this time. After a long pause, the door opened a crack, and Ben found himself looking into the weary, cautious eyes of a woman. She was thin, her face pale and gaunt, with bruises visible beneath the layer of makeup she'd applied hastily. Her lips trembled, and her eyes darted around before finally landing on him. "Sherry?" Ben asked softly, trying to convey his sincerity through his voice. "I'm here about Layla. I want to make sure you both are safe." At the mention of her daughter's name, her eyes filled with an overwhelming fear. She glanced over her shoulder, then whispered urgently, "You need to leave. He could come back any minute." Ben's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sherry, please, let me help you." Layla slipped a note into my pocket. "She's asking for help. If you're in danger, we can protect you. But I need you to trust me." Sherry hesitated, her face contorting as she fought to hold back tears. I don't know if we can. Marcus, he's dangerous. He won't stop until he finds us." The raw fear in her voice filled Ben with a renewed resolve. He had seen too many lives destroyed by fear and abuse, too many children left to fend for themselves. He wouldn't, let Layla be one of them. "Sherry, I promise you," he said, his tone low and unwavering. "I will do everything I can to keep you safe, but I need to know where Layla is. Is she here?" Sherry's face crumpled, and she bit her lip, her gaze flicking toward the darkened hallway behind her. She opened the door a little wider, and for the first time, Ben could see the small figure standing at the end of the hall, clutching a worn teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. It was Layla. Ben felt an overwhelming wave of relief mixed with anger at the situation that had left this young girl so terrified and alone. He stepped inside, reaching out to Layla, who took a cautious step forward, her eyes flickering with a small glimmer of hope. "It's okay, Layla," he whispered, offering her a comforting smile. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." As Layla took his hand, Ben knew this was just the beginning. He had found them, but protecting them from Marcus and uncovering the full extent of the danger they faced would be an entirely different battle, and one he was more determined than ever to win. A family in hiding. Ben sat across from Sherry and Layla in their cramped, dimly lit kitchen, the silence thick with tension and unspoken fears. Layla clutched her mother's hand tightly, as if afraid that even the slightest release would mean losing her again. Sherry's face was drawn and pale, her eyes hollowed with exhaustion, and her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for finding us," she murmured, her words laced with both relief and lingering fear. "I don't know how much longer we could have stayed hidden." Ben nodded, his mind racing as he took in the small, fragile family before him. The house was in worse shape than he'd anticipated. Cracked walls, peeling wallpaper, and a musty smell permeated the space, telling the story of a life in hiding and hardship. Layla's eyes were fixed on him, wide with that same fearful intensity that had drawn him to her in the first place. "Sherry," he began gently, "you don't have to keep running. I'm here to help you, and I can make sure Marcus doesn't get near you or Layla again. But you have to trust me." Sherry sighed, looking down at the table as if searching for answers in its worn-out wood grain. "Trust," she echoed. I want to trust you, officer, but Marcus isn't like other people. He's different." Her voice faltered, and her hand tightened around Layla's. "You don't know what he's capable of." Ben leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen his record, Sherry. Assault charges, restraining orders, arrests. I know enough to understand the kind of danger he presents, but Layla slipped me a note asking for help. She trusted me, and I'm not about to betray that trust." The mention of the note seemed to break something in Sherry. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she brought a trembling hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. I thought maybe we could keep going, just us, hiding from him. But every day, it feels like he's closer, like he'll walk through that door any minute." Ben's gaze softened, and he looked over at Layla, who was trying to be brave, but her young face was etched with worry far beyond her years. He could see the scars of fear etched into both mother and daughter, an unspoken history of survival that he was only beginning to understand. "Sherry, you don't have to keep hiding," Ben said, his voice steady. We have shelters, resources, ways to protect you and Layla. And as long as I'm here, Marcus won't touch you." Sherry nodded, wiping her eyes, but a flicker of doubt remained. She looked over at Layla, who gazed back at her mother, offering silent reassurance. This wasn't just her decision. It was Layla's too. Finally, she took a deep breath, reaching out to place her hand over Ben's. "All right," she whispered. "I'll trust you." Ben felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was only the beginning. They still had to put a plan in place, something airtight to keep Marcus away from them. As he looked around the rundown house, his resolve hardened. No child should have to live like this, in fear of what might happen if the wrong person found them. "First," Ben said, rising to his feet, "I'm taking you both somewhere safe for the night. You shouldn't stay here another minute." Sherry looked hesitant, casting a nervous glance at the door. "Where would we go?" "I know a safe house nearby," he assured her. "It's used by the police department for situations like this. There you'll have access to resources, a secure location, and people trained to help families in distress. I can't promise it will be permanent, but it's a start." Layla's eyes lit up slightly at the idea, a glimmer of hope breaking through her anxious expression. Sherry looked at her daughter, then back at Ben, her face filled with gratitude and apprehension. "All right," she agreed softly. "Just, please don't let him find us." Ben helped them gather a few essential items: clothes, medications, and Layla's beloved teddy bear, which she hugged tightly against her chest. As they left the house, Ben took a final look at the place, hoping this would be the last time Sherry and Layla would have to call it home. As they drove to the safe house, Ben briefed Sherry on the next steps. She listened quietly, holding Layla close in the back seat, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. By the time they reached the small, nondescript building tucked away on a side street, Ben could see that both mother and daughter were ready for rest. A kind-faced woman named Rosa greeted them at the door, her calm demeanor instantly putting them at ease. "Welcome," Rosa said, smiling warmly at Sherry and Layla. "We'll make sure you're comfortable here. You're safe now." Ben waited until Sherry and Layla were settled before stepping aside with Rosa. He explained the situation, emphasizing the danger Marcus posed and the need for confidentiality. Rosa nodded, her face serious as she took in each detail. "We'll keep them safe, Officer Harper," Rosa assured him. "You can count on us." Ben nodded, his heart heavy as he watched Rosa lead them into a room down the hall. The door closed, and for the first time in days, he felt a sliver of hope. They were safe, if only for the moment, and that was more than they'd had before. But as he walked back to his patrol car, Ben's thoughts turned to Marcus. He couldn't let the man keep terrorizing Sherry and Layla, and he knew Marcus wouldn't stop until he found them. If Marcus learned that Ben was involved in helping them, it could make things even more dangerous. Back at the station, Ben reviewed Marcus's file once more, studying every detail, every address, every contact. He needed to understand this man, to anticipate his moves. The reports painted a chilling picture of a man with a quick temper, a history of violence, and an obsession with control. Ben reached out to a few trusted colleagues, briefing them on the situation and asking for their support. He knew he'd need all the help he could get. With Marcus's history and erratic behavior, he had no doubt that the man would make another attempt to find Sherry and Layla. That night, Ben sat alone in his darkened office, the quiet punctuated only by the ticking of the clock. His mind replayed the day's events, from Sherry's fearful eyes to Layla's tentative hope. He could almost feel the weight of their survival resting on his shoulders. For so long, he had carried guilt for not being able to save his daughter, and now, perhaps, he had a second chance to protect this little girl who had found him in her darkest hour. As he gathered his things to head home, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rosa at the safe house. "Layla wanted you to know she feels safe. Thank you." The simple message warmed his heart, filling him with a renewed determination. He was making a difference, but his work wasn't done. The next morning, Ben received a call that sent a chill through his spine. It was Officer Mike, his partner, and the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Ben, you're not going to believe this," Mike said, his voice low. "Marcus was seen in town last night. Word is he's been asking around, looking for Sherry and Layla. He knows they're here." Ben's grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing. Marcus was getting closer, and if he was already in town, it meant they had little time. "All right," Ben said, his voice grim. "I'm heading to the safe house now. If Marcus is here, I won't let him get within a mile of them." He grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the station, adrenaline coursing through him. The drive to the safe house was a blur, every minute stretching unbearably long. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus getting too close, finding a way past their defenses. His heart pounded as he pulled up to the safe house, where Rosa was waiting for him at the door. "Rosa," he said, his voice breathless, "where are Sherry and Layla?" "They're safe," Rosa replied, sensing his panic. "But I've been watching for anything suspicious." Ben took a steadying breath, relieved but aware of the looming threat. He instructed Rosa to keep a heightened watch, then turned to leave, knowing he needed to stay a step ahead of Marcus. But as he reached his car, a figure caught his eye in the distance, watching the safe house from a darkened corner across the street. His blood ran cold as the man's face came into view. It was Marcus. The man's eyes were fixed on the building, his expression dark and intent. Ben didn't hesitate. He approached Marcus, his steps firm and deliberate, his hand hovering near his holster. Marcus turned, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the officer. "Officer Harper," Marcus greeted, a smirk spreading across his face. "Nice to see you." Ben forced himself to stay calm, his voice low and controlled. "This is the end of the road, Marcus. If you come near Sherry or Layla again, I will personally make sure you're behind bars for the rest of your life." Marcus chuckled, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You think you can keep them from me? Sherry belongs to me. That little girl, too." Ben felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. "Stay away from them. You've already caused enough pain. Don't make this worse for yourself." Marcus sneered, stepping closer. "You don't understand, officer. Sherry and Layla are mine. You're just in the way." Ben stood his ground, his eyes unyielding. "If you come near them again, I won't hesitate to use every resource I have to protect them. You've been warned, Marcus. Leave. Now." Marcus stared at him, his face twisted with rage, but after a tense moment, he backed down, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Ben watched him go, a sense of grim satisfaction filling him. He had bought them time, but he knew Marcus wouldn't give up that easily. As he walked back to the safe house, Ben knew this fight was far from over. But he was ready to face whatever came next. He would stand guard, protect Layla and Sherry with everything he had. Marcus had tried to find them, to break them, but as long as he was there, they would be safe. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The net tightens. Ben sat in his patrol car just down the street from the safe house, his eyes trained on every shadow, every car, every passerby. Marcus's presence in town had ramped up his vigilance tenfold. He personally threatened Marcus, and while it was a necessary risk, Ben knew the man's rage would only intensify. The clock crept toward midnight, the town's silence broken only by the occasional distant bark of a dog or the hum of a passing car. Despite the calm, Ben's pulse raced as he recalled Marcus's words. "Sherry and Layla are mine." The chilling declaration echoed in his mind, reminding him that, to Marcus, this wasn't over. Inside the safe house, Rosa kept watch over Sherry and Layla, both of whom had finally managed to drift off into a fitful sleep. Ben had given her strict instructions to call him at the first sign of anything unusual, no matter how small. He wasn't taking any chances. As the hours dragged on, Ben's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Mike, who'd been investigating Marcus's recent activities. "Ben, gotta leave on Marcus. He's staying at the Skylark Motel. I'm parked a block away, watching his moves. Thought you'd want to know. Relief mixed with a renewed sense of urgency. If Marcus was holed up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, it meant he was planning something. His proximity to the safe house was more than a coincidence. He was watching, waiting, and likely planning his next move. Ben's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he formulated his next steps. He called Mike, who picked up on the first ring. "Mike, thanks for the tip." Any sign of movement? Ben's voice was low, careful not to disturb the quiet of the night. "Not yet," Mike replied, his voice cautious. "But I don't think he's just here for a casual stay. He keeps glancing out the window, like he's waiting for something. I've got a feeling he's got something planned." "Stay put," Ben instructed. "I'll join you at the motel in 10. As he drove to meet Mike, Ben's mind raced through possible scenarios. Marcus had made it clear he wasn't letting go of Sherry and Layla without a fight, and Ben knew that if Marcus found them, there would be no reasoning with him. This was a man who saw his family as possessions, and men like that didn't back down easily. When Ben pulled up near the motel, Mike waved him over. He pointed toward the second floor, where a dim light glowed from one of the rooms. They'd positioned themselves far enough back to remain unnoticed, but close enough to observe any movement. "What's the plan, Ben?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben considered his options. Confronting Marcus directly here was risky. There were too many civilians nearby, and Marcus would likely evade them if he sensed they were closing in. They needed him off guard, isolated, somewhere he couldn't hide. "We need him somewhere less public," Ben replied. "Somewhere he won't have the chance to slip away." Mike's eyes narrowed, and he nodded. "Got it. What if we make him think he has a lead on Sherry and Layla? Draw him out." A grim smile crossed Ben's face. "Exactly what I was thinking." They quickly set a plan in motion. Ben called Rosa and updated her, instructing her to reinforce the safe house's security and keep Sherry and Layla in their rooms, out of sight. He trusted Rosa implicitly, and knowing she was with them put his mind at ease. Once they'd arranged the details, Ben dialed Marcus's cell number, which he'd gotten from the police files. The line rang, and after a long, tense pause, Marcus answered, his voice dripping with hostility. "What the hell do you want, Officer Harper?" "Thought you'd like to know," Ben replied evenly. "Sherry and Layla are still in town. I think you'd recognize the address. An old friend of yours lives nearby. Ever heard of the Maple Street abandoned lot?" There was a long, cold silence. Ben could almost feel the fury radiating from the other end. "You don't know who you're messing with, Harper," Marcus hissed, his voice laced with malice. "Sherry and that kid are mine." "Come prove it," Ben replied, his voice calm and unwavering. "Unless you're afraid." Ben ended the call, exchanging a grim nod with Mike. It was a gamble, and he knew it, but he was banking on Marcus's pride, his need to assert dominance over anyone who tried to stand between him and his family. The abandoned lot on Maple Street was a desolate, empty space where an old warehouse had once stood. Overgrown weeds and crumbling concrete were all that remained, creating a haunting landscape lit only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. The police had cordoned it off years ago, marking it as unsafe, which made it the perfect place for a final confrontation. Ben and Mike waited in silence, their breaths misting in the cool night air. They'd positioned themselves behind a line of concrete slabs, concealed from view, but able to see the entire lot. Just past midnight, a set of headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the lot's entrance. The car rolled to a stop, its engine idling, and Ben saw Marcus step out, his shadow long and menacing against the moonlit pavement. He scanned the area, his movements jerky and impatient. "Come on out, Harper." Marcus's voice was a harsh echo in the empty space. "I'm not playing your games." Ben took a steadying breath, feeling the tension coiling inside him. This was it. He stepped out from behind the slabs, his hand resting on his holster, and faced Marcus across the distance. Mike stayed hidden, ready to step in if things turned ugly. "Where are they?" Marcus snarled, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "They're safe," Ben replied, his voice steady. "And they're not coming back with you, Marcus. This ends here." Marcus let out a bark of laughter, a sound twisted by anger and contempt. "You think you can just take what's mine? You're nothing, Harper. Just a meddling cop who doesn't know when to quit." Ben's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "They don't belong to you, Marcus. Sherry and Layla deserve to live without fear, and I won't let you take that from them." For a moment, Marcus's mask of arrogance faltered, replaced by a flash of rage so fierce it sent a chill down Ben's spine. Then, in a swift motion, Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife, its blade catching the dim light. Ben's training kicked in, and he kept his gaze locked on Marcus, his hand tightening around his holstered weapon. "Put it down, Marcus," he warned, his voice firm. But Marcus only laughed, his grip on the knife unyielding. "I told you, Harper. Sherry and that little girl are mine. I'll never let them go." Ben took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He knew that any wrong move could escalate this into something deadly. But just as he prepared to reason with Marcus one last time, Mike stepped out from the shadows, his gun drawn. "It's over, Marcus," Mike said, his voice like steel. "Put down the knife." Seeing himself outnumbered, Marcus faltered, a look of panic flashing across his face, but his eyes remained wild, filled with a twisted determination. Ben took another step forward. "You're out of chances, Marcus. Put down the knife, or you'll regret it." There was a tense moment of silence, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as if Marcus might comply. But instead, he lunged, his face contorted in fury, as he closed the distance between them. Ben sidestepped, catching Marcus's arm and twisting it behind him, forcing the knife from his grip. Marcus struggled, his strength fueled by desperation, but Ben held firm, pinning him to the ground. Mike moved in swiftly, securing Marcus's hands behind his back with handcuffs. "Let me go," Marcus spat, thrashing against the restraint. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Ben replied, his voice cold. "You're done, Marcus." As Mike called for backup, Ben stayed close, watching Marcus with a mixture of relief and disgust. This man had inflicted unimaginable fear and pain on the people he claimed to love. And now, finally, he would face the consequences. Later that night, after Marcus was taken into custody, Ben returned to the safe house, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Rosa met him at the door, her face brightening when she saw him. "They're safe?" she asked, her voice filled with relief. "Yes," Ben replied, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "He won't be bothering them again." Rosa nodded, her expression softening. "Sherry and Layla have been through so much. Knowing that Marcus is out of their lives, it'll make a world of difference." Ben made his way down the hall to their room, where Sherry and Layla were waiting. Sherry looked up as he entered, her face a mix of hope and uncertainty. "It's over," Ben said gently. "Marcus is in custody. You don't have to run anymore." For a moment, Sherry just stared at him, her expression one of disbelief. Then, slowly, a smile broke through, and tears filled her eyes. Layla let out a breath, a tiny, trembling sound, and ran into Ben's arms, clutching him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "Thank you for saving us." Ben held her close, feeling the final pieces of his own guilt and pain begin to heal. For years, he'd carried the weight of his daughter's loss, of failing to save her when she needed him. But in Layla's embrace, he felt a sense of redemption. As Sherry came over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, Ben looked at both of them, his heart swelling with gratitude. They had found safety, hope, and family, even if it was in the unlikeliest of places. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt at peace. This wasn't just the end of a case, it was the beginning of a new life for all of them. New beginnings. The days that followed Marcus's arrest felt like a dream to Sherry and Layla. For the first time in years, they could sleep without fear, knowing the man who had haunted their lives was finally gone. But adjusting to this new freedom was bittersweet, a gradual process of unlearning the habits of fear and survival they had lived by for so long. Ben continued to visit them at the safe house, checking in on their well-being and helping them navigate the aftermath. Sherry had begun to open up, revealing layers of resilience and strength that Ben had only glimpsed in their first tense meeting. And Layla, no longer the frightened girl he'd met at the park, now smiled more freely, her eyes alight with a sense of possibility. One afternoon, as Ben sat with Sherry in the safe house's modest living room, she looked over at him, gratitude filling her eyes. "Ben, you've done more for us than I can put into words," she said quietly. "It's like you gave us a second chance at life." Ben felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. "You and Layla deserve every bit of happiness and safety," he replied. "And I'm not going anywhere. You have my word." Sherry smiled, her face softening with a warmth he hadn't seen in her before. "It's been so long since I've known what it feels like to trust someone. I've forgotten that not everyone is like him." Ben gave her a reassuring nod, understanding the weight of her words. In the weeks since Marcus's arrest, he'd watched Sherry slowly regain her confidence, rebuilding a part of herself that had been chipped away over the years. Layla, too, was blossoming, her quiet strength emerging now that she no longer had to bear the burden of protecting herself and her mother. But even as Sherry and Layla healed, Ben felt his own transformation unfolding. Their journey had reignited something within him, something he'd thought he had lost forever, the ability to believe in redemption, both for others and for himself. A few weeks later, Ben helped Sherry and Layla move into a small, cozy apartment a few blocks away from the safe house. It was a modest place, but filled with light and, more importantly, peace. Sherry had secured a job as an assistant at a local community center, where she worked with women and children going through similar struggles. For the first time in years, she felt like she was making a difference, sharing her experiences to help others find hope. One Saturday, Ben visited them to help with some final moving boxes. Layla, full of energy, helped him carry a small bookshelf into her room, grinning as she set it up next to her growing collection of books and toys. "Now I can keep all my books in one place," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Ben chuckled, feeling a deep satisfaction as he watched her, knowing how far she'd come from the scared little girl who had slipped a desperate note into his pocket. "You know, Layla," he said, smiling, "you're braver than anyone I've ever met. You know that, right?" Layla nodded shyly, but her expression grew serious. "I was brave because I knew you'd help us. And you did." Ben's heart swelled, and he reached out, ruffling her hair gently. "You helped yourself, Layla. All I did was follow your lead." They spent the afternoon setting up the last of the apartment, and by evening, the space felt warm and inviting, filled with laughter and the cozy aroma of the dinner Sherry had cooked. As they sat around the small kitchen table, Sherry served them, her smile soft but genuine. She looked around, taking in the sight of her daughter's smile, the comforting presence of Ben, and the quiet peace of a new beginning. "It's hard to believe we're finally here," she murmured, her eyes misting with emotion. "There were so many nights I thought this day would never come." Ben placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. "You fought hard for this, Sherry. You and Layla both did. You've earned every bit of peace and happiness that comes next." They ate together, savoring the meal and each other's company. For Ben, it felt like more than just a dinner. It felt like family, something he hadn't experienced since his own daughter's passing. The empty spaces in his heart felt a little fuller, and he silently thanked fate for leading him to Layla that day in the park. After dinner, Layla tugged at his sleeve, her eyes filled with excitement. "Will you read me a story, Officer Ben?" Ben grinned. "Of course. What'll it be?" She led him to her room, where a new stack of books awaited, and handed him a well-worn copy of Charlotte's Web. He read to her, his voice soft and comforting as she lay curled up beside him, her eyelids growing heavier with each word. When she finally drifted off to sleep, Ben gently closed the book and placed it on her bedside table, watching her peaceful face in the dim light. In that moment, he realized he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose. As he rose to leave, Sherry stood by the door, her gaze warm and steady. She reached out, touching his arm. "Ben," she began, her voice filled with a depth of gratitude he'd never expected. "I don't think we'd have survived this without you. Layla and I, we've talked, and we both agree. We want you in our lives, as much as you're willing." Ben felt a rush of emotion, an overwhelming sense of joy mixed with relief. He hadn't realized how deeply he'd longed to hear those words. "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be here, as long as you need me." In the weeks and months that followed, Ben became a steady presence in Sherry and Layla's lives. He'd join them for dinners, help Layla with her homework, and even took her to the local park on weekends, watching her laugh and play with other children, her fears finally melting away. On one of those weekends, as they walked through the park, Ben noticed a glint of something silver around Layla's wrist. It was the charm bracelet he found on that first day, the small heart charm catching the sunlight. He smiled, a sense of closure washing over him. "Layla, you kept the bracelet," he said, his voice filled with warmth. She nodded, looking down at it fondly. "It's my lucky charm. It helped me find you." Ben's heart swelled, and he pulled her close, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of family. This was the beginning of something beautiful, an unexpected but deeply cherished connection that had transformed them all. As they walked back to join Sherry, Ben felt an overwhelming gratitude for the life that lay ahead, a life filled with laughter, love, and the warmth of family. He had found healing in the most unlikely of places, and he knew now, without a doubt, that he would protect and cherish them for as long as he lived. The journey they'd shared was one of survival, of courage, and ultimately of love. And as they stepped forward into the future, they knew that together, they could face anything that came their way. For Layla, Sherry, and Ben, life was finally full of hope, and the shadows of their past had faded, replaced by the light of new beginnings. A future of courage. Weeks passed, and with each day, Layla and Sherry seemed to breathe more easily, shedding the layers of fear they had worn for so long. For Layla, school had become a haven, a place where she could learn, make friends, and even laugh freely, her worries about the past beginning to fade. She was a quick learner, and every time Ben visited, she proudly showed him her latest schoolwork or shared stories of her new friends. One Saturday morning, Ben joined them at a community picnic organized by the town, a rare event that drew together families from all over Willowbrook. Layla had been eagerly anticipating the picnic all week, her excitement infectious. She skipped ahead of Ben and Sherry, holding Ben's hand and tugging him toward the games area where kids were already playing. "Come on, Officer Ben," she said, a giggle breaking through her voice. "We're going to miss the sack race." Ben laughed, feeling a sense of joy he hadn't experienced in years. All right. Let's see if I still have what it takes." Sherry followed, her smile softer, watching as Ben and Layla lined up for the race. Layla's confidence in Ben's presence made her heart swell. She could see the healing that their friendship had brought to both her daughter and Ben himself. The race began with a bang, and soon, Ben and Layla were bouncing along in unison, laughter filling the air as they tried to keep up with the other kids and parents. By the time they crossed the finish line, they were both breathless and grinning from ear to ear. Layla beamed with pride, her happiness so radiant it was impossible not to share in it. After the race, they joined Sherry at a picnic table where she had set up a small spread of sandwiches and lemonade. As they ate, Layla shared stories about her new friends at school and her growing interest in art, a passion Ben was quick to encourage. He promised to bring her a sketchbook and pencils for her to draw whenever she liked. "Maybe you'll be an artist one day, Layla," Ben said, smiling. Layla looked thoughtful, a shy smile spreading across her face. "Maybe, or maybe I'll be a police officer like you." Ben blinked, caught off guard by her words, and then smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You know, Layla, I think you'd be great at that, and you'd definitely make me proud." Sherry looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a new sense of hope and trust in the future. As the day turned to evening, Ben and Sherry sat together on a bench, watching as Layla joined a group of kids playing a game of tag. They laughed softly, sharing stories of their past, their voices quiet as they reflected on the twists of fate that had brought them together. "Ben," Sherry said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if I've ever thanked you enough for all you've done for us. You didn't just help us survive, you gave us a life again." Ben looked at her, his expression warm and understanding. "I think you and Layla gave me just as much, if not more. I've been walking through life without a purpose for so long. Meeting you two changed that." Sherry's eyes shone with gratitude. "You're part of our family now, Ben. I can't imagine our lives without you." Ben felt his heart tighten with emotion. He'd once thought the word family belonged only to his past, a memory he would carry alone. But now, as he looked at Sherry and Layla, he realized he'd found a family in the present, one he could protect, love, and grow with. The night grew chilly, and they decided to head home. Ben helped them carry their things, feeling a deep sense of contentment as he walked them to their door. He hugged Layla goodnight, his heart warming as she clung to him for an extra second, her small voice whispering, "Good night, Officer Ben." "Good night, Layla," he replied, ruffling her hair. Days later, a surprise awaited him at the police station. As he walked into the precinct, he was greeted by a familiar face. Rosa, the caseworker from the safe house. She held a large envelope in her hands and looked up as he approached, her expression both excited and a little emotional. "Officer Harper," she greeted warmly. "I was hoping to catch you." Ben smiled, curious. "What brings you here, Rosa?" Rosa handed him the envelope, her eyes twinkling. "Sherry and Layla asked me to deliver this. They wanted to thank you for everything." Ben opened the envelope, revealing a collection of photos. There were snapshots from the picnic, candid shots of Layla playing, and even a few of the three of them together, smiling and carefree. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn picture by Layla, a colorful sketch of the three of them standing together under a bright sun, each figure holding hands, with the words, "My family," scrawled at the top in Layla's careful handwriting. Ben felt his eyes sting with unshed tears as he looked at the drawing, touched by the depth of its meaning. He'd spent so long alone, haunted by the past, never imagining he would find such happiness and belonging again. Layla had given him a gift he could never repay, a place in her heart, a place in their family. "Thank you, Rosa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Rosa smiled softly, her gaze warm. "You've done so much for them, Officer Harper. Sometimes life has a way of repaying us in ways we don't expect. You were there for them in their darkest hour, and now they're here for you." Ben nodded, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. He tucked the photos back into the envelope, promising himself he'd treasure them for the rest of his life. One evening a few weeks later, Sherry invited Ben over for dinner at their apartment. Layla had been planning it all week, excitedly chatting about the menu and helping her mother prepare the meal. When Ben arrived, the aroma of Sherry's cooking filled the apartment, and Layla greeted him at the door with a proud smile. "Guess what, Officer Ben," she said, tugging him toward the table. "I helped cook dinner tonight." "Well, I'm sure it's going to be delicious," Ben replied, smiling down at her. As they sat down to eat, Ben marveled at how far they'd all come. The past months had transformed them all, weaving their lives together in ways none of them could have foreseen. Laughter and warmth filled the room, and for the first time, Ben felt at home in a way he hadn't in years. After dinner, Layla fetched the sketchbook Ben had given her, proudly showing off her latest drawings. Sherry joined them, her eyes shining with pride as they admired Layla's work. Ben realized then that they had become something more than friends. They were family. "Layla," Ben said, his voice soft, "I think one day you're going to do great things." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with determination. "Do you really think so?" Ben nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "I know so." As the evening drew to a close, Sherry walked Ben to the door. They stood in the soft glow of the porch light, a comfortable silence between them. Finally, Sherry reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "Thank you, Ben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For being here for us, for giving us hope." Ben looked down at her, his eyes filled with warmth. "Thank you, Sherry. You've given me a second chance at life, more than you could ever know." She smiled, and in that moment, they both understood that this wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new life together, a life filled with love, family, and the promise of a future free from fear. As Ben walked back to his car, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had come full circle, from a man burdened by loss to one who had found redemption and love in the most unexpected of places. In the days that followed, they continued building their lives together, each moment a testament to resilience and the courage to start anew. Layla blossomed, Sherry found her strength, and Ben found a family that healed his heart. Together, they faced the future with hope, knowing that as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't overcome.